If this story of wilderness, courage, and the unspoken language between humans and animals touches your heart, and you want to experience more emotional journeys like this one, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button to support us, leave a comment with your thoughts on today's tale, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of these incredible bonds. Your support helps us bring these wild heart stories to life. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. In the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness of Montana, a storm wasn't merely weather, it was a living, breathing entity, a white beast consuming everything in its path. At the center of this freezing maelstrom, 10-year-old Leo knelt in the snow, his small body trembling so violently that his teeth shattered the silence of his own mind. He wasn't shivering from the cold alone. He was vibrating with a primal terror that froze his blood faster than the sub-zero air. Standing less than 10 feet away from him was a creature that looked less like an animal and more like a myth, hewn from shadow and moonlight. It was a gray wolf, but to call it simply a wolf felt like an insult to its majesty and its terror. She was massive, her winter coat thick and bristling, silver-tipped fur standing on end along a spine that seemed made of steel. Her amber eyes, burning with a ferocious, intelligent intensity, were locked onto Leo. Her lips were curled back, revealing canines that looked capable of snapping a femur like a dry twig. A low, rumbling growl emanated from her chest, a sound so deep Leo felt it vibrating in his own ribs. Leo was alone. His father was miles away, likely battling the same whiteout to get back to their cabin. There was no gun, no radio, no hope of rescue. Just a boy and an apex predator in a standoff that nature usually resolved in seconds, with a spray of crimson on white snow. But Leo didn't run. He didn't scream. Instead, he slowly, painfully unzipped his heavy parka. The movement was agonizingly slow, his frozen fingers fumbling with the zipper. The wolf took a step forward, her growl rising in pitch, a warning that patience was thinning. Leo gasped as the cold air hit his chest, but he reached inside his coat. With trembling hands, he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a bundle of fur. "I have him," Leo whispered, his voice cracking against the wind. "I have him. He's safe." He held out the small, limp form of a wolf pup. The massive female froze. The ferocity in her eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, flickering with confusion and a desperate maternal recognition. This was the moment, the heartbeat between life and death. To understand why a 10-year-old boy was offering a wolf pup to a raging alpha in the middle of a blizzard, we have to go back to where the silence began. 2 weeks earlier, the world had been a different kind of quiet. Leo lived with his father, Jackson, in a remote cabin skirting the edge of the Gallatin National Forest. Since Leo's mother had passed away 3 years prior, the silence in the cabin had been heavier than the snowdrifts outside. Jackson, a man of few words and deep grief, had buried himself in the hard labor of maintaining the homestead and his work as a freelance guide. He loved Leo fiercely, but the bridge of communication between them had been washed away by a river of shared sorrow. Leo, in turn, had turned to the woods. The forest didn't look at him with pity. The trees didn't ask him how he was holding up. The wilderness just was. It demanded presence, and in that demand, Leo found a strange sort of peace. He spent his afternoons after homeschool lessons exploring the creek beds and ridges, learning the tracks of the elk, the erratic patterns of snowshoe hares, and the rare ghost-like prints of the timber wolves that roamed the high country. It was on a Tuesday, unseasonably warm for late November, that the incident occurred. The thaw had been rapid, dangerous. The creek near their property, usually a trickling vein of ice, had swollen into a churning torrent of slush and debris. Leo had been warned, strictly and repeatedly, to stay away from the banks during a thaw. But the sound of the water was hypnotic, a roar that drowned out the quiet of the empty cabin. He was skipping stones, watching them vanish into the brown, violent water when he heard it. It was faint, a high-pitched yip that barely cut through the drone of the rushing river. Leo paused, tilting his head. He waited. There it was again, a sound of pure distress. Curiosity, that dangerous companion of childhood, pulled him upstream. He scrambled over slick granite boulders and pushed through dense willow thickets until he saw it. About 20 yards out, a large deadfall tree had been swept into the river, its branches snagged on a submerged rock. The trunk was bobbing violently in the current, threatening to break loose and hurtle down the rapids at any second. Clinging to a fork in the branches, wet and shivering so hard it looked like a vibrating blur, was a pup. It wasn't a dog. The ears were too large, the paws massive even for a puppy. It was a wolf cub, likely separated from the pack during the chaotic river crossing caused by the sudden melt. The cub was exhausted, its claws slipping on the wet bark. Every time the log bucked in the current, the pup dipped perilously close to the freezing water. Leo stood frozen on the bank. He knew the rules of the wild. Let nature take its course. He knew the danger. A mother wolf would be nearby, and she would be frantic. But as he watched, the log gave a sickening crack. The branch anchoring it to the rock was splintering. The cub let out a wail that sounded terrifyingly human. It was the sound of being small, alone, and hopeless. It hit Leo in the center of his chest, tearing through the callousness he had tried to build up since his mom died. He looked around. No mother wolf, no help. "Hold on," Leo shouted, the words ripping from his throat before he could stop them. He scanned the bank. The water was icy death. He couldn't swim to it, but the log had swung closer to a jutting outcrop of rock. If he could get to that rock, he might be able to reach the branch. Leo dropped his backpack. He moved with a singular focus, climbing out onto the slick, icy outcrop. The spray from the river hit him instantly, soaking his jeans and stinging his face. The cold was a physical blow, knocking the breath out of him. He scrambled on his hands and knees, the rock biting into his skin. He reached the edge. The log was 5 feet away, bobbing in and out of reach. "Come on," Leo gritted his teeth, extending a branch he had grabbed from the shore. "Grab it." The pup was too terrified to move. It stared at Leo with wide, panicked eyes, frozen in the survival mode. Then the anchoring branch snapped. The log lurched free. "No!" Leo screamed. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct, Leo lunged. He didn't jump into the water. He threw himself flat onto the very edge of the rock, hooking his legs around a boulder, and plunged his upper body into the freezing spray. He stretched his arm out, his fingers straining. The log swept past. The pup, dislodged by the sudden motion, slid off the bark and into the churning black water. Leo didn't hesitate. He grabbed. His hand closed around the scruff of the pup's neck just as the current tried to suck it under. The weight of the water was immense, threatening to pull Leo in with it. He screamed with effort, his muscles burning, the cold paralyzing his shoulder. He hauled backward, scraping his chest against the granite, pulling with everything he had. With a wet thud, he yanked the bundle of wet fur onto the rock. Leo scrambled back, clutching the pup against his jacket, gasping for air. He was soaked, freezing, and shaking, but he was alive. And in his arms, coughing up river water, was the wolf. The rescue had been a matter of seconds, a last minute that felt like a lifetime. Leo looked down. The pup was dark gray, almost black, with a patch of white on its chest. It was shivering violently, its eyes squeezed shut. Leo knew he couldn't leave it here. The scent trail was washed away by the river. The mother would never find it before the cold did. He unzipped his jacket and stuffed the wet, shivering creature against his wool sweater. "I've got you," he whispered, the adrenaline fading into a profound sense of responsibility. "I've got you." The walk back to the barn was a blur of paranoia. Every snapping twig sounded like a predator. Leo didn't take the pup into the house. His father would notice immediately. Instead, he set up a hidden sanctuary in the hayloft of the old barn. He used old horse blankets to make a nest and brought dried venison jerky and warm water from the house, sneaking around like a thief in his own home. For the next 3 days, Leo lived a double life. By day, he did his chores and studied. By night, and during every stolen moment in between, he was in the loft. He named the pup Shadow because of how silent he was. The bond was instantaneous and chemical. It wasn't just that Leo was feeding him, it was the way Shadow looked at him. When the pup's eyes finally cleared and focused, they held an intelligence that unnerved Leo. Shadow didn't play like a dog. He watched, he studied, and when he slept, he curled into the crook of Leo's neck, his heartbeat syncing with the boys. Leo talked to Shadow. He told the wolf about his mom, about how much he missed the smell of her baking, about how his dad looked through him like he was a ghost. He poured all the grief he had been holding inside into the soft, gray fur of the wild animal. And Shadow listened, occasionally licking the salt of tears from Leo's cheek with a rough, warm tongue. But the wild cannot be contained in a barn forever. On the fourth day, the weather turned. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour, and the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. A blizzard was coming, a bad one. Jackson was out checking the perimeter fence, miles away. Leo was in the barn feeding Shadow, who was growing stronger by the hour. The pup was pacing, restless. He would stop and stare at the barn door, letting out low, uncertain whines. "What is it, boy?" Leo asked, stroking the pup's head. Shadow pulled away, trotting to the cracks in the barn wood, sniffing deeply. The hair on his neck stood up. Then Leo heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a howl, long, mournful, and terrifyingly close. It cut through the wooden walls of the barn and settled in the marrow of Leo's bones. Shadow froze. Then he threw his head back and let out a tiny, high-pitched yip in response. No, quiet," Leo hissed, scooping the pup up. "You can't answer. She'll kill us." Leo knew enough about wolves to know that a mother searching for her lost pup was the most dangerous thing in the forest. If she found him here in the territory of humans, she would perceive everything as a threat. The howling grew closer. It was joined by others. A pack. Panic set in. Leo realized he had made a mistake. By keeping the cub, he had drawn the pack to their home. If his father came back now, there would be a slaughter. Either Jackson would shoot the wolves, or the wolves would attack Jackson. "I have to take you back," Leo realized, his heart hammering. "I have to take you to the tree line." It was a foolish, childish plan born of desperation. He thought if he could just get the pup away from the cabin, the mother would find him there, and they would leave. Leo dressed in his heaviest gear. He grabbed the pup, tucking him securely into his coat, and slipped out of the barn. The storm hit him the moment he stepped outside. The wind knocked him sideways. The snow was falling so fast it was like standing inside a milk bottle. Visibility was zero. Leo pushed forward, heading toward the tree line where he had heard the howls. He walked for what felt like an hour, but was likely only 20 minutes. The cold was biting through his layers. The snow was knee-deep and drifting higher. He was disoriented. The familiar landmarks, the old oak, the fence post, were gone, swallowed by the whiteout. "Just a little further, Shadow," he gasped. He stumbled, falling face first into a drift. He lay there for a moment, the temptation to just close his eyes overwhelming him. "It's so warm," he thought. "Maybe I'll just rest." A sharp nip on his ear made him yelp. Shadow had wriggled his head out and bitten him. The pain snapped Leo back to reality. Hypothermia was whispering to him. He scrambled up. He turned to go back, or what he thought was back. But the tracks he had made were already gone. He was lost. He wandered blindly, the cold seeping into his core. He huddled against the base of a large pine tree, trying to shield Shadow from the wind. "I'm sorry," Leo sobbed, the tears freezing on his face. "I'm so sorry, Shadow." And then the wind shifted. The scent of pine and ice was replaced by a musk, heavy, wild, and distinct. Leo looked up. Emerging from the swirling wall of snow, not 5 paces away, was the alpha female. She was colossal. The size of the wolf up close was something books and documentaries never prepared you for. Her paws were like dinner plates. Her breath plumed in the air like smoke from a dragon. She didn't look like a dog. She looked like a prehistoric force. She stopped. She lowered her head. Her lips peeled back to reveal gums black as coal and teeth white as the snow. Grrr! The sound was felt more than heard. It was a vibration that rattled Leo's teeth. She crouched, muscles coiling in her hind legs. She was preparing to spring. She saw a human. She smelled her stolen pup. In her mind, Leo was the predator, the thief. Leo scrambled to his knees, his hands numb. This was the moment. The last minute was happening again, but this time he wasn't saving the pup from the water. He was saving the pup from the mother's misunderstanding and saving himself from her wrath. "I have him," Leo screamed against the wind, his voice breaking. He ripped his zipper down. The cold slashed at him. He pulled Shadow out, holding the pup up like an offering to an angry god. The alpha female froze in mid-crouch. Her amber eyes widened. Shadow yipped, a joyful, desperate sound, and wriggled in Leo's grip. The mother wolf took a step forward, her growl dying in her throat, replaced by a sharp intake of air. But she didn't relax. She looked at the pup, then at Leo. Her eyes narrowed. She was assessing. Was he a threat holding a hostage, or a savior returning a gift? Then, behind the alpha, two more shadows emerged from the whiteout. Two male wolves, sleek and dangerous, flanked her. They lowered their heads, ears pinned back, waiting for her command. Leo was surrounded. He stood in the center of the kill circle, his heart hammering against the ribs of the wolf pup in his hands. He sank to his knees in the snow, extending his arms fully, placing the pup gently on the snowdrift between him and the mother. "Take him," Leo whispered, his energy draining away as the cold finally claimed his legs. "Please, just take him." Shadow bounded through the deep snow, tumbling clumsily until he reached the massive female. She instantly lowered her head, nudging him aggressively, sniffing him over, licking the snow from his face. She confirmed it was him. She checked for injuries. She looked up. Leo expected her to turn and leave. He expected the pack to vanish into the storm, leaving him to freeze to death alone under the pine tree. That was the way of the wild. The transaction was complete, but she didn't leave. The alpha female stepped over her pup. She walked slowly toward Leo. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the bite. He waited for the crushing pressure of jaws on his neck. Instead, he felt a hot blast of air on his face. He smelled raw meat and wet fur. He opened his eyes. The wolf's face was inches from his. Her amber eyes were searching his. There was no aggression now, only an intense alien curiosity. She sniffed his face, her cold nose brushing his frozen cheek. She sniffed his hands, which smelled of her pup. She let out a soft woof of breath. Then she did something impossible. She turned her broad side to him and sat down, blocking the wind. She looked at him over her shoulder, then looked at her flank, and then back at him. It was a gesture of invitation, a command. Get close or die. Leo stared, his mind reeling. The storm was getting worse. The light was failing. He was miles from home, freezing to death, surrounded by a wolf pack, and the alpha was offering him heat? Leo didn't think. Instinct, older than his fear and sharper than the cold, took over. He crawled forward on hands and knees that felt like blocks of wood, the snow crunching loudly in the sudden silence between wind gusts. The alpha didn't flinch. She remained a statue of silver and shadow, her massive flank rising and falling with a steady, rhythmic breath that promised life. When Leo pressed his body against hers, the heat was shocking. It wasn't just warmth, it was a furnace, a vibrant biological energy that seemed to buzz against his freezing skin. He gasped, the sensation burning his numb nerves. The wolf turned her head, her muzzle inches from his ear. She didn't growl. She exhaled, a long, huffing sound that smelled of pine needles and raw game, and then laid her heavy head down on her paws, watching the dark tree line. Moments later, the two male wolves moved in. They didn't attack. They didn't posture. They simply collapsed the perimeter, curling up tight against the alpha and the boy. Shadow, the pup Leo had pulled from the river, scrambled into the center of the pile, burying himself between Leo's chest and his mother's belly. Leo was no longer a boy lost in the wilderness. He was a piece of the pack's puzzle, a strange, hairless cub that needed the collective heat to survive. As the storm raged overhead, burying the world in white, Leo drifted into a delirium of exhaustion. He wasn't asleep, but he wasn't awake. He was suspended in a twilight state where the boundaries between human and animal dissolved. He could feel the slow, powerful thump of the alpha's heart against his back. It was slower than his, a deep tectonic rhythm that calmed his own frantic pulse. In that huddle, listening to the wind scream impotently, outside their wall of fur, Leo realized something profound. He had never felt safer in his life. Not in the cabin with the locked doors, not in his bed with the heavy quilts. Here, surrounded by the apex predators of the northern Rockies, he was part of something unbreakable. Miles away, the silence of the cabin was screaming at Jackson. He had returned an hour ago, battling whiteout conditions that had nearly driven his truck off the logging road. He had burst through the door, calling Leo's name, expecting to find the boy curled up by the wood stove with a book. Instead, he found a cold hearth and an empty house. Panic, cold and sharp as a knife, had sliced through his exhaustion. He checked Leo's room. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. Then he saw the back door unlatched, swinging slightly in the draft. He ran to the barn. The horses were spooked, shifting uneasily in their stalls, but Leo wasn't there. It was in the loft, among the scattered hay and the hidden stash of venison jerky wrappers, that Jackson found the clue. A single dark gray wolf hair caught on a splinter of wood. Jackson fell to his knees, the breath knocked out of him, as if he'd been kicked by a mule. The tracks outside were already filling with snow, but the faint depression of small boots leading toward the tree line was still visible. "Leo," Jackson whispered, the name tearing from his throat. Memories he had tried to bury for 3 years clawed their way to the surface. He remembered the hospital room, the sterile beep of the monitor, the feeling of his wife's hand turning cold in his. He had promised her, sworn to her on everything he held holy, that he would keep their son safe, that he would protect the one good thing left in their shattered world. And now he had failed. Jackson didn't grab his heavy coat. He was already wearing it. He grabbed his rifle, a lever-action .45-70, and a heavy flashlight. He shoved a flare gun into his pocket. He didn't care about the storm. He didn't care about the odds. He plunged into the white abyss, a father-turned-hunter, tracking the most precious game he would ever seek. The wind howled like a banshee, mocking him. "Please," he begged the darkness, a man who hadn't prayed since the funeral. "Don't take him too. Take me. Take anything. Just not him." He tracked for hours, fighting terrain that wanted to kill him. The snow was thigh-deep in places. He fired the flare gun twice into the black sky, watching the red phosphorus burn and fade, swallowed by the indifference of the storm. No answer, no cry for help, just the wind. Morning broke not with sunlight, but with a gray, diffused luminescence that filtered through the snow-laden branches. The wind had died, leaving behind a world sculpted in silence and ice. Leo woke up to a rough, wet sensation on his cheek. He groaned, his body stiff and aching. He opened his eyes to see Shadow licking his face, the pup's tail wagging furiously. Leo tried to sit up, but a heavy weight pinned his legs. He looked down. The alpha female's massive head was resting across his knees. She opened one amber eye, looking at him with a sleepy, almost bored expression. She yawned, a display of teeth that reminded Leo of the danger he was sleeping with, and then stood up, shaking the snow from her coat in a cloud of powder. Leo sat up, shivering as the cold air rushed into the space where the wolves had been. He was alive, his fingers were numb, and his toes felt like stones, but he was alive. The alpha chuffed, a sharp sound that brought the two males to their feet. They stretched, their spines elongating, and looked at Leo. There was no aggression, but there was an expectation. The pack was moving. Leo stood up on wobbling legs. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice raspy. "We have to go home." He looked around. The landscape was unrecognizable. Drifts of snow 6 feet high had reshaped the forest. He had no idea which way the cabin was. Panic flared again, hot and acidic. The Alpha took a few steps, then stopped. She looked back at Leo. She let out a low bark, sharp and commanding. She walked a few more paces, breaking a trail through the deep snow with her powerful chest, then stopped again, looking back. She was waiting for him. "You want me to follow?" Leo asked, his breath pluming in the air. The wolf didn't answer with words, but her body language was clear. She turned and began to trot purposefully through the snow, not away from civilization, but along the ridgeline. Shadow bounded after her, struggling in her deep footprints. Leo followed. He walked in the wake of the Alpha, stepping where she stepped. The 2 male wolves fell in behind him, a rear guard. He was being escorted. The journey was brutal. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on Leo's shoulders. He stumbled often, his energy reserves depleted. Every time he fell, the pack stopped. Once, when he stayed down for too long, overcome by dizziness, Shadow ran back and nipped at his glove, pulling and growling playfully until Leo forced himself up. They walked for what felt like hours. Leo's vision began to tunnel. He focused only on the silver tip of the Alpha's tail ahead of him. Left foot, right foot, breathe, don't die. Then the Alpha stopped abruptly. Her ears swiveled forward, the hair on her hackles rose. Leo bumped into her flank, too exhausted to stop in time. She didn't snap at him. She pressed her body against his legs, pushing him back toward the safety of a large spruce tree. A low, menacing growl began to rumble in her chest, far deeper and more violent than the one she had directed at him the night before. Leo peered around her thick fur. 50 yards ahead, in a clearing that Leo vaguely recognized, stood a massive shape. It was dark, shaggy, and motionless. A bull moose. Moose were notoriously ill-tempered in deep snow, prone to charging anything that moved. This one was huge. Its antlers a heavy shovel rack that could crush a wolf or a boy with a single toss of its head. It blocked the only path through the ravine that led to Leo's valley. The moose lowered its head, snorting. It had seen them. The Alpha didn't retreat. She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the moose and Leo. The 2 males fanned out, flanking the threat. They were smaller than the moose, significantly so, but they moved with a fluid, liquid coordination that was terrifying to watch. The moose charged. It was an explosion of snow and muscle. The ground shook. "No!" Leo screamed, thinking the wolves would be trampled. But they didn't stand their ground. They flowed. As the moose thundered toward the Alpha, she feinted left, then snapped right, her jaws clicking shut inches from the moose's hock. The moose bucked, kicking out with hooves sharp enough to split a skull. The Alpha rolled, dodging the blow by a millimeter, and sprang back to her feet. The 2 males harried the moose from the sides, barking and snapping, turning the giant beast, confusing it. They weren't trying to kill it. They were driving it off. They were clearing the path. The Alpha launched a mock charge at the moose's nose, forcing it to rear up. In that split second of distraction, she barked a sharp command. The message was clear: run, but not for the wolves. For Leo. Leo understood. He scrambled through the deep snow, skirting the edge of the clearing while the moose was occupied with the spinning, snapping whirlwind of gray fur. He reached the other side of the ravine, his lungs burning. He looked back. The wolves were disengaging. They melted away from the moose, retreating into the trees with ghostly speed, leaving the confused giant snorting at the empty air. Moments later, they reappeared at Leo's side, tongues lolling, unharmed. The Alpha nudged Leo's hip with her nose. Hard. Keep moving. They crested the ridge, and there, in the valley below, Leo saw the most beautiful thing in the world. A thin column of gray smoke rising against the blue sky. The cabin. He started to run, or try to run, stumbling down the slope. "Dad," he croaked, his voice too weak to carry. "Dad." The wolves stopped at the tree line. This was the boundary, the invisible line between the wild and the tame. They would go no further. Leo turned back. Shadow was whining, taking a few steps toward Leo, then looking back at his mother. The pup was torn. "Go," Leo whispered, tears freezing on his lashes. "Go to your mom, Shadow. You're safe now." The alpha looked at Leo one last time. The connection was palpable, a shared knowledge of the night, the cold, and the survival. She dipped her head, a regal nod of acknowledgement. Then she turned and vanished into the trees. Shadow lingered for a second, gave a high-pitched bark, and scampered after her. Leo turned and stumbled toward the cabin. He made it another 100 yards before his legs finally gave out. He collapsed in the snow, the adrenaline fading, leaving him unable to rise. He lay there, watching the smoke, thinking this was it. He was so close. Then he heard it, the crunch of snowshoes, the heavy breathing of a man running. "Leo!" It was a roar of anguish and hope. Leo tried to lift his head. "Dad?" Jackson fell upon him. He didn't gently pick him up. He scooped him out of the snow, crushing him against his chest, burying his face in Leo's ice-encrusted hat. Leo felt his father shaking, great heaving sobs that racked his strong body. "I've got you," Jackson choked out, repeating the words Leo had said to the pup. "I've got you. Oh God, I've got you." Jackson carried him into the cabin, stripping off the frozen clothes, wrapping him in heated blankets, pouring warm broth into him. He checked every inch of his son for frostbite, weeping openly when he saw the boy was whole. "I thought—" Jackson's voice broke as he sat by the fire, holding Leo's hand in both of his. "I thought the cold took you, or the wolves. I saw tracks. I saw wolf tracks everywhere, Leo. Giant ones." Leo looked at the fire, the warmth returning to his bones. "They did take me, Dad." Jackson froze, his eyes widening. "What?" "They took me," Leo said softly. "But they didn't hurt me. They kept me warm. They brought me home." Jackson stared at his son, disbelief warring with the evidence. He had seen the tracks. He had seen how they surrounded the boy's trail. But there was no blood, no violence. "Why?" Jackson asked, the word barely a whisper. "Why would they do that?" Leo reached into his pocket, which had been hanging on the drying rack, and pulled out the single small object he had kept from the river rescue, a smooth stone he had found right before hearing the yip. He turned it over in his hand. "Because I saved the little one," Leo said, looking his father in the eye. And she knew it. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, but not just for Leo's physical body. The dynamic in the cabin shifted. The silence that had separated father and son was replaced by a new kind of quiet, a reverent shared understanding. Jackson didn't dismiss Leo's story. He couldn't. He had seen the tracks on the ridge, the way the wolf prints flanked Leo's boots, the signs of the scuffle with the moose. He realized he didn't know the wilderness or his son as well as he thought. But the story wasn't over. The bond hadn't severed. It had merely stretched. Winter turned to spring. The snow melted, revealing the scars on the land and the new growth pushing through. Leo spent every day scanning the tree line, waiting. He didn't approach the woods with the same careless freedom as before. He approached it with respect. He saw them occasionally, a gray shadow moving through the pines, a silhouette on the ridge at dusk. They were watching him. It was midsummer when the trouble started, not from nature, but from men. A group of ranchers from the valley below had been losing livestock. Calves were disappearing. The anger was mounting, hot and dangerous. They blamed the wolves. They blamed the pack that roamed the high ridges. Shadow's peck. Jackson came home one evening, his face grim. He placed a flyer on the table. It was a predator control notice. The state had authorized a cull. A hunting party was organizing for the weekend. They were coming with dogs, high-powered rifles, and a hatred fueled by lost profits. "They're going to kill them, aren't they?" Leo asked, his voice steady, though his hands trembled. "They're wolves, Leo. Jackson said gently, though he looked pained. They're killing cattle. It's what happens. Not these wolves, Leo insisted. I watch them. They stay high. They hunt elk. It's the coyotes taking the calves, Dad. You know it is. Jackson sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew Leo was likely right. The sign was all wrong for wolves. But the mob didn't care about sign. They cared about blood. There's nothing we can do, son. It's the law. We can warn them, Leo said. Leo, you can't talk to wolves. I can try. That night, Leo lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He felt a pull in his chest, a magnetic north dragging him toward the mountains. He owed them a life. They had given him his. Now, death was marching up the mountain in the bed of pickup trucks, and he was the only one who knew the truth. He didn't sneak out this time. He walked into the living room where his father was staring into the dying embers of the fire. I'm going up there tomorrow, Leo said, before the hunters. I have to scare them off. I have to make them move their den deeper into the wilderness. Jackson looked at his son. He saw the boy who had survived a blizzard in a pile of wolves. He saw the strength of his wife in Leo's eyes. He stood up. You're not going alone, Jackson said, reaching for his boots. If we're going to drive a wolf pack out of their territory to save them, we're going to need a plan, and we're going to need to be loud. The next morning, before the sun had even kissed the peaks, father and son stood at the edge of the tree line. The air was crisp. Somewhere up there in the dense timber was the Alpha, Shadow, and the rest of the family. And somewhere behind them, on the logging roads, the trucks were already starting their engines. Ready? Jackson asked. Ready, Leo said. They stepped into the trees, not as hunters, but as guardians. But they didn't know that the threat on the mountain wasn't just the men coming up from below. Something else had moved into the territory, something old, hungry, and far less forgiving than a wolf. A rogue grizzly, woken early and starving, was claiming the ridge, and Leo was walking straight into its path. The forest was not silent, it was holding its breath. The birds had ceased their morning chorus, and the wind had died down to a whisper, leaving the air thick with a heavy, suffocating stillness. Leo moved through the underbrush, his senses heightened to a painful degree. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Beside him, Jackson moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent his life in these woods, his rifle held low but ready, his eyes scanning the dense patchwork of shadow and light. They were racing against time, a race measured in the rumble of diesel engines echoing up from the valley floor. The hunters were coming. We need to get to the ridge, Jackson whispered, pausing to check the wind. If we can fire a few warning shots from the high ground, we might spook the pack into moving toward the deep wilderness before the dogs pick up their scent. Leo nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the chill of the morning. They're close, Dad. I can feel them. He wasn't talking about the hunters. He was talking about the wolves. The pull in his chest was stronger now, a vibrating compass needle pointing north. He knew they were near. They pushed through a dense thicket of lodgepole pine, emerging into a rocky clearing filled with blueberry bushes. The berries were long gone, eaten by the local black bears, but the scent of crushed leaves and damp earth was strong. Then the smell changed. It hit Leo like a physical blow, a stench of rotten meat, wet fur, and old blood. It was a smell he didn't recognize, but his instincts recoiled from it violently. Dad, Leo said, his voice trembling. Something's wrong. Jackson stopped. He lifted his head, sniffing the air, his face drained of color. He gripped Leo's shoulder hard. Back up, slowly. But it was too late. From behind a massive boulder at the edge of the clearing, the earth seemed to heave. A creature of nightmare rose onto its hind legs, towering nearly 9 feet tall. It was a grizzly, but not a healthy one. Its coat was patchy and matted with pop and dirt. One ear was torn away, and a long, jagged scar ran down its snout, pulling its lip up in a permanent, grotesque sneer. It was thin, its ribs showing through the fur. A starving, desperate killer that had woken too early from hibernation and found the world empty of food. except for the boy. The bear dropped to all fours with a huff that shook the bushes. It didn't roar, it didn't posture, it simply charged. The speed of a grizzly is a terrifying paradox. Nothing that large should move that fast. It covered the ground in bounding, ground-eating strides. "Run!" Jackson screamed. He shoved Leo hard to the side, raising his rifle, but the footing was loose shale. As Jackson pivoted, his boot slipped. He went down hard, the rifle clattering out of his reach, sliding down the slope. Leo scrambled backward, tripping over a root. He hit the ground, the breath driven from his lungs. He looked up to see the mountain of muscle and rage bearing down on him. The bear ignored Jackson. Its predatory focus was locked on the smaller, easier prey. Leo couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. He stared into the small, beady eyes of the bear and saw no humanity, no mercy, just a void of hunger. He curled into a ball, covering his head, squeezing his eyes shut, waiting for the end. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, Mom." The ground shook as the bear closed the distance. Leo felt the heat of its breath, the spray of saliva. Then a gray blur hit the bear like a missile. There was a sound of impact, wet and heavy, followed by a roar that shattered the sky. Leo looked up. A wolf had latched onto the bear's neck. It wasn't the massive alpha female. It was smaller, sleek, and fast as lightning. It was Shadow. The young wolf had grown over the winter, his chest broad and his jaws powerful, but against the grizzly he looked like a toy. Yet he held on, his teeth sunk deep into the loose skin behind the bear's ear, snarling with a ferocity that defied physics. The bear roared in surprise and pain, rearing up and shaking its head violently. Shadow was whipped through the air like a rag doll, but he didn't let go. He was buying time. "Leo, get back!" Jackson was scrambling up the slope, searching frantically for his weapon. The bear swiped a massive paw, claws like knives, and connected with Shadow's flank. The wolf yelped, a sharp, high sound that pierced Leo's heart, and was thrown 10 feet, landing hard in the bushes. The bear turned back to Leo, enraged now. It lunged, but before it could take a step, the clearing erupted. The alpha female exploded from the tree line, followed by the two males. They didn't bark, they didn't hesitate. They hit the bear as a unified force of nature. The alpha went low, snapping at the bear's hamstrings with bone-crushing force. The males flanked, tearing at the bear's soft underbelly. It was a chaotic, swirling vortex of teeth and fur. The bear, confused and surrounded, swiped blindly, roaring in frustration. It tried to turn to face one attacker, only to be bitten by two others. Leo scrambled backward, crawling toward his father. Jackson grabbed him, pulling him behind the cover of a fallen log. He had his rifle now, but he couldn't shoot. The wolves and the bear were a tangled knot of motion. A bullet meant for the bear could easily kill a savior. "They're protecting me," Leo gasped, watching with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Dad, they're protecting me." The bear was powerful, but the wolves were strategic. They used their agility, darting in and out, exhausting the giant. The alpha was relentless. She was fighting not just for territory, but for the strange, hairless pup she had warmed in the snow. Finally, the bear had enough. Bleeding from a dozen wounds, confused and overwhelmed, it turned and bolted. It crashed through the brush, heading down into the ravine, away from the flashing teeth of the gray ghosts. The wolves didn't pursue. They stopped instantly, panting heavily, their chests heaving. The silence that followed was deafening. "Shadow," Leo whispered. He stood up, ignoring his father's warning hand. He walked into the clearing. The two male wolves were licking their wounds, pacing nervously. The alpha stood in the center, watching Leo. She had a gash on her shoulder, oozing blood, but she stood tall. But Shadow didn't get up. The young wolf was lying in the blueberry bushes, his breathing shallow. Leo fell to his knees beside him. There was a deep laceration on Shadow's flank where the bear's claws had connected. "Shadow," Leo choked out, reaching out a trembling hand to stroke the wolf's head. "You saved me. You crazy idiot, you saved me." Shadow opened his eyes. They were hazy with pain, but when he saw Leo, He let out a soft whine and tried to lift his head to lick Leo's hand. "Don't move," Leo commanded softly, tears spilling onto the wolf's fur. "Just rest." "Leo," Jackson's voice was urgent. Leo looked up. The sound of engines had stopped. Now there were voices, shouts, the baying of hounds. The hunters were here. They had heard the roar of the bear and the commotion. They were coming up the trail, less than 100 yards away. The Alpha's ears swiveled. She knew what the dogs meant. She looked at Shadow, then at the tree line, then at Leo. She let out a low, urgent whine. She couldn't move Shadow fast enough. If they stayed, they would be cornered. "They're coming," Jackson said, stepping up beside Leo. He looked at the wounded wolf, then at the Alpha. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the plea that transcended species. Jackson racked the lever of his rifle. He looked at the Alpha. "Take him," he said, gesturing to the deep woods. "Go, I'll handle them." The Alpha seemed to understand the tone, if not the words. She moved to Shadow, nudging him hard. The two males came over, and together they helped the young wolf rise. Shadow whimpered, limping heavily, leaning against the Alpha. "Go," Leo urged, pushing Shadow gently. "Run." The pack began to move, melting into the shadows of the deep timber. Shadow looked back one last time, his amber eyes locking with Leo's. In that look, there was a promise, a recognition. "We are blood now." Then they were gone. Moments later, the brush crashed open. 3 men in camouflage burst into the clearing, breathless, rifles raised. 2 baying bloodhounds strained at their leashes, going wild with the scent of wolf and bear. "We heard it!" the lead hunter shouted, a large man named Miller. "Sounded like a war. Did you see them? Did you see the pack?" He scanned the clearing, seeing the disturbed earth, the blood on the leaves. "There's blood. We got one. Turn the dogs loose." He reached for the clip on the hound's leash. "No," Jackson said. The word was spoken quietly, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Jackson stood in the center of the trail, his rifle held across his chest, not aimed, but clearly a barrier. Miller stopped, confused. "What did you say, Jackson?" "I said no," Jackson repeated, stepping forward. "There are no cattle killers here, Miller." "Don't give me that," Miller spat. "I smell wolf. The dogs smell wolf. Look at the blood." "That's bear blood," Jackson lied smoothly, pointing to the direction the grizzly had fled. "And wolf blood. A rogue grizzly attacked my son." The hunters froze. They looked at Leo, who was standing covered in dirt, his jacket torn, his face streaked with tears and grime. "A grizzly?" Miller asked, his grip on the leash loosening. "It came out of nowhere," Jackson continued, his voice hard. "It would have killed him. It would have killed him." Jackson's voice cracked slightly, the reality of the moment hitting him. But the pack interfered. They hit the bear. They drove it off. They saved his life. Silence stretched in the clearing. The hunters looked at each other. This was ranch country. They hated wolves. But the code of the West was complicated. You didn't kill the thing that saved a child. "You're telling me," Miller said skeptically, "that a pack of wolves saved your boy from a grizz?" Leo stepped forward. He wiped his face with his sleeve. "The black one," Leo said, his voice steady and fierce. "The one with the white chest. He took the hit for me. He's hurt. If you send those dogs after them, if you hunt them down after what they did, then you aren't men. You're just killers." Miller looked at the boy. He saw the absolute conviction in his eyes. He looked at Jackson, who stood like a stone wall, a father who had almost lost everything. Miller looked down at his dogs. The hounds were still pulling, whining to follow the scent of the wounded wolf. Miller reached down. He grabbed the dogs' collars and pulled them back. "A rogue grizzly, you say?" Miller asked, looking toward the ravine where the bear had gone. "That's a danger to the whole valley. Can't have a man-eater around?" "It's headed toward the canyon," Jackson said, pointing away from the wolves' retreat. "It's hurt. Slow." Miller nodded. He turned to his men. "Change your plans, boys. We're tracking a bear. Big one. Dangerous." He looked back at Jackson and Leo. He tipped his cap. It was a gesture of respect and an apology. "You get the boy home, Jackson. We'll handle the bear." The hunters turned and headed down the ravine, their voices fading as they planned their new pursuit. Jackson let out a breath he felt he had been holding for an hour. He lowered his rifle and turned to Leo. He pulled his son into a hug, tight and desperate. "You were right," Jackson whispered into Leo's hair. "I'm sorry I doubted you. You were right." 5 years later, the autumn air in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness was crisp, smelling of turning aspen leaves and coming snow. Leo sat on the same rock outcrop where he had pulled a drowning pup from the river years ago. He was 15 now, taller, his shoulders broad from chopping wood and hauling hay. He had his camera with him. He had started documenting the wildlife, helping the local conservation group track migration patterns. He was building a bridge between the ranchers and the wild, using his photos to show that coexistence was possible. He sat perfectly still, the telephoto lens resting on his knee. He hadn't seen them in 2 years. The pack had moved deep into the interior, far away from the cattle and the roads, just as they should. That was the price of their safety. Distance. But today Leo felt it again. That pull. He scanned the tree line across the river. Nothing. Just the wind moving the pines. He was about to pack up when a movement caught his eye. There, standing in the shadow of a massive spruce, was a wolf. He was magnificent. His coat was thick and dark, turning to silver along the spine. He had a white patch on his chest, shaped like a diamond. He moved with a heavy, powerful grace, the limp from an old injury barely noticeable, just a slight hitch in his gait. It was Shadow. He was the alpha now. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He slowly raised his hand, palm open, a greeting. Shadow stopped. He looked across the rushing water, his amber eyes locking onto Leo's. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't yip. He stood in regal silence, a king acknowledging an old ally. Then, from the trees behind him, 3 pups tumbled out, playing in the leaves. Shadow turned his head and let out a soft, correcting growl. The pups froze, then scurried back to safety. Shadow looked back at Leo one last time. He lifted his head and let out a howl. It wasn't a cry of distress this time, nor a warning. It was a song. It rose into the clear blue sky, echoing off the canyon walls, a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. Leo listened until the last note faded. He didn't take a picture. Some moments were too sacred for film. They belonged only to the memory and to the heart. "Good life, brother," Leo whispered. Shadow turned and vanished into the wilderness, a ghost returning to the mist, leaving Leo alone on the rock, but never, ever lonely. If this story of loyalty, survival, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and a wolf touched your soul, please help us share more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment below about what you would have done in Leo's place. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you're always the first to join us for the next adventure. Stay wild.